Hi, Kate.
Hello, everybody. The participants are joining the session now, so we'll just wait a few minutes, give everyone a bit of time to metaphorically take their seats, I think.
Hi, Sadet. Het is Ludo.
Hoi, Ludo.
Welkom.
Dank je.
We gaan zo meteen starten.
Goed.
Hi, Ludo.
Hi.
Well apprised of UK politics.
Welcome to everyone who's just joined us. We're waiting another couple of minutes or more to come into the room, but we won't be too long. Just a minute or two more and then we'll start.
To answer shortly to Berna, you are right here. It's everything okay.
Okay, I think now's the time to make a start. So, welcome everyone. Welcome to Voices for Peace. This is the final session of our No to NATO Counter Summit, organised over the last 2 days by the International No to War, No to NATO Network. My name's Kate Hudson, and alongside Rainer Brown, we'll together be facilitating this session. As we know, today NATO leaders have gathered in Brussels. It's been more fanfare going on for global leaders, so-called, from the wealthy countries. We've had that also for the last couple of days in my own country, in Cornwall, where the G7 have been gathering. So they're really having a fest together. The overwhelming messaging coming out of the summit is about NATO's new hostility to China. And of course, in this, they are following in the wake of the US and most recently, the UK. No doubt also they will reinforce their commitment to nuclear weapons and to massive military spending at a time when they should be spending on dealing with the climate catastrophe and sorting out the pandemic. Once again, we find that NATO leaders are at odds with their populations. Here in the UK, we've had a poll recently showing the overwhelming majority want global abolition of nuclear weapons. And we know that that is mirrored across NATO states. But our voices are ignored. So this session is an antidote to the top-down politics of NATO. No leaders here, no global leaders. This is where we hear the voices of people globally speaking out for peace. And we've got a great lineup of activists from around the world. Everyone is speaking for 2 minutes. So this is your warning, speakers, that after 2 minutes, I'm going to give you a little verbal nudge and tell you your time's up. Otherwise, we could be here all night. So if we have any time at the left at the end, then if people have put comments or questions in chat, we could look at some of those and read some of those out, or have a bit of extra contributions, but it depends how we do on the time. So Rainer, over to you to introduce and welcome our first speaker.
Thank you so much, Kate. My name is Rainer Braun. I'm the Executive Director of the International Peace Bureau and also a member of the Coordinating Committee, No to War, No to NATO. And it's a great pleasure to lead you through these voices against NATO, to the protest against the militarization, which we have started yesterday and continue today. This is the opposite of what we can see in Brussels. This is peace, disarmament, and global justice. The first speaker is coming from the country where the NATO summit happened, from Belgium, from Corbyn Mp. It's Isabelle Rombrand. And Isabelle, the floor is to you.
Thank you all. I feel honored as a Belgian peace activist to speak here first today, together with all these voices for peace, online, but strongly connected in a common struggle against NATO. Today in my country, in Brussels, the first NATO summit with US President Biden is taking place. A major Belgian newspaper headlines this morning, NATO plays a key role in Biden's doctrine. Yes, we all have already witnessed NATO reinventing itself several times, only to safeguard the economic and strategic interests of the US and its allies. NATO is shedding its skin again today. NATO 2030, the NATO's ambition of the near future, speaks of bigger, greater resilience against systemic rivals, China and Russia. What should we, as Western working class, as peoples worldwide, and especially from the South, think about this? As if the war alliance is not already committed enough to militarization and confrontation. Resilience, as in more sophisticated nuclear weapons, as in more disinformation to create supposed fear against supposed enemies, as in even bigger military budgets, provocations far from home, like in the South China Sea. Yes, I am worried, not only as an activist, but also as a mother, as a human being. about this new Cold War we are all dragged into. But that is why I'm also militant and also hopeful. Yesterday, we stood with several hundred activists in Brussels with only one message: yes to peace and no to NATO. The pandemic has taught us many wise lessons about the importance of the essential workers, about international solidarity, like the Cubans and the Chinese threw up medics, not bombs. One thing is certain, for me, war is not an essential sector. And don't tell us that NATO protects our security. It only protects the profits of a few Western multinationals. Their wars, but our lives. It's time we reclaim the streets again with a big and a broad peace movement. I am ready for it and I hope you join us. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Isabel. And I can say that you were just like 1 second under your time. So how perfect. Well done. Thank you very much. So I'm going to introduce our next contributor, who I believe we are welcoming by video. Is that correct, Rainer or Ludo? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So many of you will know our colleague Joseph Gerson from the USA. Obviously, the whole question of the US coming back to prominence in NATO after the Trump period. This is a big deal going on at this summit. So as a counter to that, it's a pleasure to hear from Joseph Gerson, President of the Campaign for Peace and Disarmament in the US. Thank you.
Friends, I wish that I could be with you in person. Perhaps we'll all be together in Barcelona this fall. Like the 2010 Lisbon Summit, this week's 2.5-hour NATO confab, its brevity reflects how undemocratic the alliance really is being convened under the false facade of unity in order to adopt a new strategic doctrine. NATO 2030 completes the transformation from what was once called the Atlantic Alliance into a new global military pact. No longer limited to operations in Europe, the Greater Middle East, and Latin America, it will now span Eurasia and the Pacific. The doctrinal change is designed to enforce U.S. global hegemony in association with its junior European and Japanese partners. To the surprise and dismay of many people here, the Biden administration is building on, but not seriously revising, the Obama-era pivot to Asia-Pacific and the Trump-era strategic guidance that was designed to contain and manage China's rise, as well as to prevent Russia's leaders from reasserting dominance in what they call their near abroad. From the beginning, NATO has been an imperial alliance. As NATO's first General Secretary remarked, the alliance was imposed to keep Germany down, Russia out, and the US in. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, its ostensible purpose was achieved, and the alliance should have been retired as a historic relic. Instead, violating the Bush-Gorbachev agreement that reunified Germany on West German terms in exchange for committing not to move NATO 1 centimeter closer to Moscow, Bill Clinton began NATO's expansion, and now its alliance, its troops and weaponry are all on Russia's borders. That guaranteed a new Cold War. NATO's Lisbon out-of-area doctrine was designed to enforce U.S. and European neocolonialism in North Africa and the Greater Middle East, as we have seen with devastating consequences in Afghanistan and in Libya. Now, British, French, and Japanese warships are joining provocative and misnamed U.S. freedom of navigation operations in the South China West Philippine Sea. With their augmented military and diplomatic support for Taiwan, the alliance is chipping away at the One China policy, increasing the danger that an accident, a miscalculation, or worse, could trigger a calamitous war. And the decoupling of China and Western societies is creating major obstacles to addressing the real existential threats faced by humanity: renewed nuclear arms races, the climate catastrophe, and current and future pandemics. We should have learned from the first Cold War that security cannot be achieved against one's rival, but only with that adversary in the course of mutually beneficial, if difficult, diplomacy. Arms races, provocative military actions, and increased military spending increase the risk of unimaginable death and destruction while simultaneously impoverishing our society. No to NATO, demand disarmament, justice, and peace.
It's a
Rainer, over to
a
you.
great honor for me now to announce a woman which is really a great fighter for peace, for human rights, and for women's rights. She was with us in so many actions against the war in Afghanistan. The next speaker will be per video Malala Joya.
Hello to everyone. My name is Malala Joya. I am from Afghanistan. I extend my utmost regards and thanks to Verity for giving me the opportunity to deliver my message on behalf of the suffering people of Afghanistan and to Nato demonstration. Dear friends, Afghanistan is in a very critical time. From one end, COVID-19 is awfully impacting the life of our people, but from another end, after 2 decades of war, destruction, and massacre of hundreds of thousands of Afghan civilians, the US administration is talking about so-called peace agreement with the Taliban. The so-called peace which the White House is talking about is just a big lie to deceive the US public and people of the world. This brutal war is far from over because a sinister dealing with a savage terrorist group armed and supported by foreign intelligence agencies will never bring peace. I strongly believe peace without justice is meaningless. Dear friends, all of you hear Joe Biden's announcement about pulling out his troops from Afghanistan by September. I hope the occupiers leave Afghanistan as soon as possible. I have repeatedly called for the foreign occupiers to leave our country. No nation can give liberation to another nation. In the past 20 years, the US has killed around 1 million Afghan people directly or indirectly. It has dropped the mother of all bombs, used cluster bombs and white phosphorus, created a mafia and corrupted the economy. It has polluted our environment and made the country the drug capital of the world. Unfortunately, NATO followed the footsteps of US. If the US and NATO leave Afghanistan, the backbone of all terrorist plans of Jihadi, Taliban, and ISIS will break. I hope they will take their terrorist plans with them when they leave. There is no doubt that in the short term, with the withdrawal of the foreign occupiers may lead to some security and economic problems, but in the long run, it is the interest of our people that they leave. Dear friends, the absence of the US military will mean that Afghanistan will not be considered as a threat to countries in the region such as China, Iran, Pakistan, India, and Russia, and it will stop them from meddling in our internal affairs, as each of these countries have their own puppets in Afghanistan for their strategic interests. The current armed race among big powers and their proxy wars in Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Yemen, Ukraine, Sudan, Libya, etc. triggers the danger of a third world war, which will have unimaginable catastrophes for the earth. The big powers led by the Pentagon are investing on terrorists and medieval groups such as Taliban, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Abu Sayyaf, Boko Haram, etc. for advancing their strategic interests. But their acts of terror are not confined to poor people of above-mentioned nations, but expanding to the cities of Western countries, as we witnessed many such coward acts in European cities over the past few years. Dear friends, stopping the savage war and brutalities and establishment of lasting peace is the moral responsibility of every conscious citizen of the world. So it is time to work for a new and better world of justice. We want all occupying countries to withdraw from Afghanistan, but the suffering of the Afghan people still needs solidarity from justice-loving and progressive movements, individuals, parties, and activists around the world. Long live freedom, democracy, international solidarity, peace, and social justice.
Fantastic. A very, very powerful message. So for those of you who are looking for translation and may not yet have found it, can I just draw your attention to the bottom of the screen? There's a button there on the right, which offers translation English, French and Spanish. So please do use that if you need to. Our next contribution is also by video. This is from Jeremy Corbyn MP, known to many of you, former leader of the Labour Party and a vice president of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. So over to Jeremy for his words.
My greetings to the network meeting this evening. Thank you for inviting me to come on this. The whole world's just been through the COVID crisis. This COVID crisis has shown the best and the worst of our country and our world. The best has been the volunteers in so many countries that have stepped out and helped others. The worst has been the greed of big corporations and the greed of governments to fund those big corporations. But there's another lesson here as well. If we live in a deeply unequal world, at the end, we all suffer and are all vulnerable from it. The British government's response has been a security review. To me, security is to have something to eat, somewhere to live, schools for your children, healthcare when you need it, and an environment that's sustainable and breathing clean air and drinking clean water. The British government's view is slightly different. They've taken the opportunity to cut overseas aid expenditure from 0.7 to 0.5% of gross national income and to increase defence expenditure by 24 billion. That can only move us in the wrong direction. The threats around the world are poverty, inequality, injustice, environmental disaster, and human rights abuses. None of those are going to be solved by rearmament, by more nuclear weapons. They're only going to be solved by people coming together, by campaigns together for a sustainable and just world. NATO needs to think about its role, needs to think about its direction. All those countries coming together in the same room could achieve so much together, or they could make the world an infinitely more dangerous place and lay the seeds for another Iraq, another Afghanistan, another Libya, and all the refugee flows that flow from it. So it's up to all of us who believe in peace, who believe in justice, who believe in human rights, to make sure it's our message and our voice that comes across. That is the real road to unity. Thanks a lot, and thanks for what you do.
What a strong message from Jeremy to all of us. And it's great to have such political leaders with us, fighting with us, and being with us on the street. The next speaker is an activist against NATO. She's coming from Canada, speaking for women's voices for peace in Canada and many other Canadian and international organizations. I welcome Tamara Lawrence and give the floor to her. Tamara, the floor is to you.
Good morning, everyone from Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. I'm bringing greetings and solidarity from the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace. We are one of Canada's oldest peace organizations. Our acronym is VOW. 2 years ago, for NATO's 70th anniversary, VOW launched a new campaign, Feminists Against Militarism, Women Say No to NATO. And we started a monthly protest outside of the NATO Association of Canada office in Toronto. We protested every month against the alliance until the pandemic caused us to shut down in March of last year. But last year, VOW held many webinars against NATO. Tonight, we are having a pan-Canadian No to NATO counter summit. We have activists from British Columbia to Nova Scotia who are going to be speaking about why we are opposed to NATO. As many of you know, Canada is one of the 12 founding members of NATO and has participated in every NATO war. It was a Canadian Lieutenant General, Charles Bouchard, who led the NATO bombing of Libya in 2011 that totally destabilized the country and led to a refugee crisis across North Africa. Now Canada is leading the NATO battle group in Latvia, and Canada is leading the NATO Standing Maritime Group. So VOW is working very hard in our country to build a resistance to NATO. We say Canada out of NATO, abolish the alliance. Thanks.
Thanks very much indeed, Tamara. Strong message again. Fantastic. Our next speaker comes from France. It's a pleasure to welcome Dea Danska-Reti, representing Le Mouvement de la Paix. Welcome, Dea. The floor is yours.
Yes, hello everybody. I will speak in French. Sorry, my English is not enough good, but my name is not Darska, but Drendarska.
Oh.
Okay, by the way, I am very glad to be with you. Lorsqu'on interroge les Français sur l'OTAN, la majorité pense que la France n'en fait plus partie. L'omerta qui pèse sur elle lui permet d'agir dans l'ombre sur les décisions de nos gouvernants. La politique militaire de l'Union européenne, donc de la France, dépend ainsi étroitement de l'OTAN, dirigée par les USA selon les traités fondateurs. L'OTAN est une institution militaire et politique créée pendant la guerre froide, qui aurait donc dû disparaître avec elle. Son action se situe à un niveau national, mais se répercute aussi sur chaque citoyen, car la militarisation de notre société et de nos esprits fait partie de ses objectifs, tout comme de ceux de nos gouvernants. Le service national universel, qui va bientôt s'imposer à tous les jeunes Français de 16 ans, en est un exemple. Financé par le ministère de l'Éducation nationale, son programme de formatage des esprits est défini par des militaires et privilégie les réflexes de compétitivité et d'agressivité au lieu d'une culture de la paix. Le sommet de l'OTAN d'aujourd'hui prévoit une discussion sur ses objectifs à l'horizon de 2030. Elle comporte une partie importante en direction de la jeunesse, déjà entamée depuis plusieurs mois, sans que l'on en connaisse les modalités. L'idéologie dominante veut nous faire croire que notre ennemi est la Russie, alors qu'elle n'observe aucune action contre nos pays. Selon le CIPRI, son budget militaire en 2020, 66,8 milliards de dollars, est 20% supérieur à celui de la France, 51,6 milliards, mais il est plus de 16 fois inférieur à celui de l'OTAN, 1088 milliards de dollars. L'OTAN est un grand propagandiste.
I'm afraid your time's up. Could you wind up, please?
Yes, okay. Le seul avenir que nous souhaitons à l'OTAN est sa disparition totale, que ces nombreux locaux deviennent des universités et des centres de recherche civile comme en France en 1966. Nul besoin pour la remplacer d'une armée européenne. Seules les Nations Unies ont la légitimité pour régler les conflits et surtout pour les prévenir. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation from France. And it's a great pleasure for me to welcome a long fighter for social justice and for the European social movement and the world social movements. The floor is to Sissi Vovou for the feminist initiative for the elimination of violence against women from Greece. Sissi, the floor is to you.
Hello, everyone. I follow all the peace activities and anti-NATO activities around the world through the list Not to NATO, for which I'm very grateful. I must say that here in Greece, we have the biggest military base in the Mediterranean, which is in the island of Crete, the Souda base. Souda is the place. And of course, they have nuclear weapons also, but there's not much talk about that. Unfortunately, because of the very difficult situation Greece is in, not only due to the COVID, it's everyone, but due to the memoranda and all this suffocation of Greek economy and by the European Union. Unfortunately, the fight against NATO and the fight for peace is a bit sidetracked. We did make lots of mobilizations for the Palestinians for the last aggression against the Palestinians, but about NATO and the peace and so on, we don't do so much. Unfortunately, some of us are fighting to increase this interest in involvement in the anti-NATO actions. I must tell you only that Greece has 2.6% of GDP for military spending, which is much above the 2% set by NATO itself. And this was before the American president and NATO asked every country to make expenses above the 2%, because we were 2.4, now we are 2.6. In this very difficult situation.
Your time's up now, so
okay. There is money for military spending, but not for everything else. Thanks for your very important activity.
Fantastic, Sissi. Thanks so much for that. Our next speaker is from Turkey, Yildiz Timurtakan. Yildiz is from the Global Movement for Social Change. Welcome, Yildiz. Over to you.
Hello, nice to be here again. I am from the World March of Women. It's an international feminist movement. It was established in 2000. So Sissi and we were met in this movement and we know each other very well. So we became a comrade in this struggle. And when we started our struggle in the year 2000, and I remember it was 20 years ago, and I joined a vigil demonstration against NATO in 2001 in Montreal. It was right before military intervention to Afghanistan. But at that time, we were alone in the street. It was very dark, rainy, and cold night in Montreal. But we had a high spirit and we were alone. But today, I saw the difference after 20 years. So we learned to work together with other social movements and peace movements. I'm very pleased to see that progress and development. And so as a feminist movement, we have very clear positions against NATO, not only just NATO, but also we organize activities against blockade and sanctions, economic sanctions as imperialist tools and military tools at the same times. And we have very clear position, military coups. And as my country in Turkey, we suffered a lot because of military coups. It's very closely associated with NATO. NATO is still important player.
Your time's up, Yildiz, I'm afraid. Sorry.
In our past, in today, and also future. That's why we are joining this struggle. Yes to peace, no to NATO.
Yildiz, thank you so much, and all the best for the very difficult fights in your country. I think your solidarity is with you. And we are jumping over the ocean. The next speaker is coming from the United States, from the International People's Assembly. His name is Rondo. Rondo, the floor is to you.
Hello, thank you, everybody. I'm actually with the Resist US-led War movement, not the International People's Assembly. The Resist US-led War movement raises our voice with the people of the world who reject NATO as a tool of US-led war. Since its founding in 1949, NATO has acted as an armed wing of US-led war and imperialism, mobilizing its 29 member states to unleash lethal military campaigns in the defense of the interests of US imperialism and its allies. As the preeminent alliance of the most economically and politically powerful allies of the US, NATO is still the premier force bolstering US-led war today. Through NATO, the US has access to any military base, domestic or overseas, of any of its members. The US also is the primary decision maker when it comes to NATO missions. Truly, the US would not be at the helm of the majority of wars of aggression today if it were not for the NATO alliance. The people reject NATO as a tool of US-led war. NATO and its proponents will never achieve real peace and security for the masses of the world. The people can only attain a genuine, just peace by organizing for justice and social equity and by forging solidarity amongst peoples, including the recognition of the right to self-determination, economic and food sovereignty, and self-defense of nations and oppressed peoples from reactionary violence, including US and NATO-led aggression. The Resist US-led war movement has formed a pledge against NATO. We say we must pledge to resist NATO, expose and oppose all NATO-led wars of aggression and intervention as attacks against the people. And more importantly, we must pledge to build a global movement for just peace, unite with and take solid action and solidarity with the nations and peoples under attack from NATO aggression. We must strengthen all movements for sovereignty, democracy, and social, economic, and political and environmental justice for the conditions for a just and lasting peace. We must build the movement to resist US-led war, no to NATO, and fight for just peace. Thank you.
Solidarity, Rhonda. What a very powerful message. Thank you for that. Now we're coming back to Europe for the next contribution from Germany. I'm welcoming now Bernhard Trautvetter, who is from the Bundesausschuss Friedensratschlag. Welcome, Bernhard.
Yes, hello. I'm greeting everyone on the planet Earth working for peace, for whom we stand. We are in Essen, Rhine-Ruhr area, active in the fight against the so-called Center of Excellence of the NATO. Strategic communications is one of their items, and they start to lie wherever they can. NATO started with a lie. It started with a story that one must defend the West against communist Soviet aggression. But the Soviet Union was destroyed in the years when NATO was founded so severely that there was no danger in this direction in the room. So the lie followed in the decades then after 1949. The Western lie was NATO must invest into arms to line up to Soviet armament, and this has never been true. But many in the West believe it because of the strategic communication, which is nothing but lying the people. In the 1980s, they had the plan Victory is Possible with anti-missile weapons, civil infrastructure, resilience, and nuclear potential to eliminate Soviet weapons. We had the success to turn these weapons away from the European continent, but the danger has remained. The international tensions, the arms race, and the ecological threats are a result of many mistakes, systematic structures like NATO armament and war fighting. NATO contributes to all these threats like no other force on earth. Now they spread the lie Russia is in danger, is the danger as one sees in the Crimea crisis. They turn the attention away from the fact that threats, that there is no other alliance on earth with more violations of the UN Charter, with no more severe violations of human rights. And so we are in the fight against NATO in Germany for decades now. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Bernhard. Thank you very much, Bernhard. This was, I think, a brilliant contribution from the German fights against NATO in different parts of Germany. So I'm coming to my colleague, with whom I'm deeply connected in the International Coordinating Committee NATO War to NATO, Jenny Toshi Visconti from Italy. I think we had a long discussion about many actions together. Jenny, the floor is to you. You have to unmute yourself. Jenny, you have to unmute yourself. Now we can
Well,
hear you.
hello, Kate. Hello, Rainer, Christine, and all the British friends, and bonjour aux amis belges et français. For those who don't, hello, Ludo. For those who don't know our group, I'm the international spokesperson for the Comitato No Guerra No Nato e Associazione per un Mondo Senza Guerre, of course, Italy, of course. Now, our group is fighting for the dismantling of nearly 100 US and NATO bases that are just sitting on our territory. And we're also fighting for the removal of US and NATO nuclear weapons in accordance with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty signed by Italy. We are living in a very dangerous period right now. It seems that US and European governments, perhaps not all in agreement, but in any case, they all follow, are dangerously approaching a war against Russia and China to prevent their economic power from being undermined by these emerging powers. The signals come from President Biden's trip to Europe. At each stage, it was a reaffirmation of this trend. Biden and Johnson revitalized the Atlantic Charter of August 14, 1941, during the Second World War, in which the future world is set, was heralded. That agreement was considered provocative by Russia at that time. Think about now. Today, at the meeting with NATO, there will certainly be no talk of reduction in nuclear weapons. On the contrary, nuclear plans are continuing. The Biden-Putin meeting will take place on June 16 in Geneva.
Jenny, your time's up, I'm afraid.
I fear that hopes of many will be dashed. The White House has already announced that the usual press conference with the two protagonists will not take place at the end of the meeting. Only Biden will hold his monologue with the press. This has a precise and negative meaning for those who hope for peace. Now we must do something because war is near and we have to fight for the future of our sons and great sons. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you. Okay, so next we're moving to the Netherlands, and it's a great pleasure and delight to welcome Sadet Karabulut, MP. Sadet is a Member of Parliament for the Socialist Party in the Netherlands. Welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, friends. A little correction. I'm former MP.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
We
but
wish you were still an MP.
Yeah, so dear friends, NATO wants us to believe that they are there for our security, for our defense. That would be nice if it were true. Let's look at the results. Take the failed war on terror of recent decades that has brought us not less, but much more terrorism, not more, but less security. Many trillions have been spent on warfare. Also, my country, the Netherlands, has wasted billions of euros on it. And the results, regime change in Libya has left the country in chaos and anarchy and has become a hub of modern slavery and migration to Europe. Afghanistan is a big fiasco based on lies. Isn't it harsh that now hundreds of thousands dead and millions of refugees further, the Taliban is back in control again? And what about the war against Iraq in 2003? That war gave us Islamic State. But now NATO, whose members themselves violate international law or look away from human rights violations when it suits them, is opening a new chapter, a new mission, a new enemy. Under the headings of democracy, the rule of law, and individual freedom, military hostility towards Russia and China is further heightened. A new Cold War should further increase military spending. Even nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction that are destructive to humanity, are part of this new strategy. A new Cold War, even more armaments and nuclear armaments, possess a major threat to the security of all our peoples. So we should not allow them to abuse us, Europe, for this. We should get rid of the nuclear weapons. We should struggle and fight for a nuke-free Europe. Disarmament Diplomatic relations and an alternative security architecture is what we need. Down with American nuclear weapons. Let's make Europe great again. Let's make peace. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sadat. And now I would like to announce Chris Nineham, but I haven't seen him. Chris, are you with us? No, maybe he is coming later. So I have the pleasure to announce Laura Capota from Colombia. And now you were asking why Colombia, but I think Laura will tell us how strong are the relations between NATO and Colombia. Laura, the floor is to you.
Hola a todos, a todas. Hablo en español. ¿Cómo están? Un saludo muy grande desde América Latina, desde Colombia particularmente. Nosotros y nosotras, como saben, estamos en un proceso de mucha lucha, en un momento de gran movilización en todo nuestro país contra las políticas del gobierno de Iván Duque, pero que no solamente son las políticas del gobierno de Iván Duque, sino también todo lo que ha implicado en Colombia y en América Latina la intervención de los Estados Unidos. Para nadie es secreto que los Estados Unidos en nuestro continente, así como en el sur global, han desarrollado la guerra que no quieren desarrollar en su país. Así que nuestro país ha sido particularmente esa punta de lanza, el inicio, la amenaza de guerra para nuestra región, y en ese marco se ha intentado utilizar al pueblo colombiano como una herramienta de guerra contra los procesos revolucionarios o progresistas de América Latina. Por eso, y también por la dureza del neoliberalismo, por la pobreza, la desigualdad, el conflicto en nuestro país, la mayoría de jóvenes y también otras generaciones organizadas hemos salido enormemente a la calle y hemos salido para decirle al gobierno de Duque y de Uribe: no más, estamos en un momento de superar esas guerras, justamente de exigir también que Colombia, que es el único miembro de América Latina que hace parte de la OTAN, salga por fin y termine siendo en algún momento de nuevo miembro de un proyecto continental que busque la paz y la unidad, y no siendo el país de nuestro continente que sigue las recetas de los Estados Unidos y que se compromete con la guerra en otros países. Así que ese saludo les queríamos dejar desde América Latina, desde Colombia, pero también desde todo nuestro continente, que como siempre somos muy orgullosos y orgullosas de representar un continente tan organizado, con tanta lucha y con tanta esperanza de transformación. Y también desde la Asamblea Internacional de los Pueblos celebramos este espacio de no a la OTAN. Exigimos ese cese de la guerra en todo el mundo y particularmente sobre los pueblos oprimidos y que hemos sufrido estas guerras. Un abrazo para todos y todas.
Thanks very much indeed, Laura. That's fantastic. Now we're going north. We're going to Finland. Very strong peace movement in Finland. So we're very delighted to welcome Ulla Kotsa from Women Against War from Finland.
Women for Peace. Women for Peace from Finland.
Okay. Women for Peace.
If we were very strong, we wouldn't be so close to NATO today. But some words from us. I will be sticking to the close NATO-EU connection. From the mid-50s to the end of the 80s, Finland was considered a neutral country. At the end of the 80s, the debate of Finland joining the EC, nowadays the EU, started. After that, the word neutrality disappeared from the political vocabulary and was substituted by the word non-alignment. Today, even that word has disappeared from the public debate. Hand in hand with the EU membership, Finland was step by step gliding closer to NATO. We who were active in the EU critical movement warned about early in the beginning, since an overwhelming majority of the EU member states were NATO members. In 1995, Finland and Sweden became EU members. Already in 1994, Finland and Sweden joined Partnership for Peace. Took part in peacekeeping led by NATO in Bosnia, Herzegovina, 96, 1999 in Kosovo, 2001 in Afghanistan. 2008, we became member of the NATO Rapid Response Force, and 2014, we signed the Host Nation Agreement. not to mention how fast Finland started to join NATO US military exercises. International training activities began and became more common in the 1990s, the EU era. In 1992, Finland bought the US Hornet fighter jets. The strongest advocates were the Prime Minister, the Defense and the Finance Ministers, who were all strong advocates of the EU. Now Finland is trying to buy new fighter jets, most likely the Lockheed Martin F-35. The connection NATO-EU is perfectly clear. On the NATO homepage, April 21, it was stated, the EU is a unique and essential partner for NATO. The two organizations share a majority of members, have common values, and face similar threats and challenges. So on top of getting more and more militarized by the EU, Finland is also today to 98% a NATO member. Conclusion, if we want to get rid of NATO, we also have to get rid of all military aspirations of the EU.
Thank you. And I hope your country will really come back to a neutral country. We all would enjoy this. So I now have the pleasure to announce Chris Nineham from Stop the War Coalition in Great Britain, who I think is since the beginning a big fighter with us against NATO. Chris, the floor is to you.
Is he there?
He was there. I saw him. Okay, when he disappeared again, I'm coming to the next speakers, and I'm very, very happy to announce Yuri Shalashenko from the Ukraine to you. He is from War Resistance International, and he is, since years, a fighter with us against militarization all over the world. Europe, Yuri, the floor is to you.
Dear friends, I am proud that civil society of the world assembled today to raise voice for peace in response to shameful NATO summit, which plans new conflicts and arms race. Warmongers have NATO 2030 strategy, while decent people demand perpetual peace instead. Atlantic propaganda says that allied nations desire to live in peace, but their military spending many times exceeds their budgets of diplomacy. NATO pretends to defend democracy, but in reality, NATO mocks democratic values by nuclear sharing, mass killings and bombings, tortures, secret prisons, cooperation with far right gangsters, shutting up critics, spying on citizens, sanctions harming civilians. NATO members Turkey and Greece, as well as post-Soviet Russia and Ukraine, have coercive military service and repress conscientious objectors. NATO leaders don't respect the will of the people to live in peace. They kill the people, they rob national budgets to fuel devastating machine of war, and they ignore nuclear ban treaty adopted by the vast majority of nations. Dictators such as Erdogan and Orban participate in NATO summits with nuclear messiah Biden and Johnson, not because of mistake, but because NATO is anti-democratic alliance. The world is tired of tough talk and confrontation. The West, China and Russia should stop insane arms race and hybrid war. We should get rid of NATO and national war chests to spend more on education and healthcare. I dream that armed conflict in eastern Ukraine and all other shooting across the world will be stopped. Donbas and Crimea will join Ukraine in the new reformed world without borders, without armies, where nobody will be shamed or prosecuted for pacifism like Ruslan Katsaba and others. Let's celebrate aspiration for peaceful future, which lives in the hearts of people of the world and gathered us today. We don't need military alliances. We need the world without violence.
Thanks very much indeed, Yuri. And if the list is now correct, I'm going to welcome Chris Nineham. Are you there, Chris? Ryan has already given you a glowing introduction when you dropped off. Are you there now?
I am.
Okay.
Can you hear me all right?
2 minutes. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, apologies. I don't know why my connection fell out. So yes, greetings from London and the Stop the War Coalition. I must say, like I guess everyone here, I've been infuriated by the lack of any kind of critical coverage of the NATO summit in the mainstream. So it's very good to have this event and the series of events trying to counteract the rhetoric around NATO. A word of advice to journalists: if you want to judge an institution, it's best to look at what it does rather than what it says. And people have already mentioned and talked about NATO's provocative push eastwards towards Russia over the last few decades, which is breaking a series of promises and clearly threatening increased tension with Russia. But I think it's important as well, we don't forget that NATO has played a central role in the West's disastrous foreign wars over the last couple of decades. Central to bombing Bosnia, they took over the catastrophic war in Afghanistan, led the bombing of Libya, which turned that country into a failed state and a breeding ground for terrorism. Now, as people have said, it's reinventing itself, expanding its remit to the South Pacific and Latin America, and obviously trying to convince us that, once again, Russia and China are existential threats. But it seems to me that against this background of involvement in foreign wars, the rhetoric about defending democratic values and the rule of law really looks laughable. And understood in this way, whatever the rhetoric it uses, it's clear that NATO is nothing more than a vehicle for aggressively pursuing the US interests and those of its allies around the world. So I think it's important to see it in that context. I also think, just finally, that this points perhaps to the best hope for building really mass opposition to NATO's operations. The recent foreign wars have been incredibly unpopular in all parts of the globe.
Can you wind up now, please?
And millions of people have mobilized against them. And just finally, in the last few weeks, hundreds and thousands of people have demonstrated in defense of Palestine and against Western support for Israel. It seems to me that these are movements that we can ally with, that can help to break up the NATO alliance once and for all. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris, for this, also for combining it with the actual fight for the rights of the Palestinian people. And, you know, I have to ask maybe Kate or the others for help. Have anyone seen Giulietta? I haven't seen her. Giulietta, are you with us?
Rainer, she told, I received a mail from her. Her connection is bad. She can't join us, and she promised to send a video, but I didn't receive anything.
Okay, up to now, greetings from Colombia or Venezuela. I think we could listen to Giulietta's great speech on Sunday. So the next speaker is Véronique Couleur from Untitled Solidarity Movement from Belgium. Véronique, the floor is to you.
Hello, thank you, everybody. So I'm very pleased to be here in this online protest, and it's very nice to see that we are so many from all parts of the country together in this fight against NATO. So as Isabel also said, today warlords are meeting in Brussels for a NATO summit. While challenges are so big in the world and poverty is rising, they ask us to rise the militarization and are dragging our countries into a new Cold War against China and Russia. Instead of investing in peace and diplomacy, our countries decide to invest in war. Fighter jets, Belgium had to buy 34 fighter jets to join in NATO's missions. Nuclear weapons, we still have nuclear weapons on Belgium's soil. And you name it. I think it's a big threat to all of our countries and to the population. On top of that, NATO is leading us to a big climate catastrophe because, as we know, the Pentagon and the military industry is one of the biggest polluters in the world and has a huge ecological impact. And as we all know, wars are being waged for natural resources. NATO knows it and is preparing for it. We were many in the streets yesterday to say no to NATO and yes to peace, and we will be many tomorrow and other days of the year in all of the world as we see it here together. That's all for my part. It's less than 2 minutes. It's to keep the balance. Yes to peace, no to NATO. Bye.
Many thanks, Veronique. Great to hear from you. Okay, so now we're turning to France again. We're pleased to welcome Edith Boulanger from Le Mouvement de la Paix. Edith, over to you if you're with us. Is Edith with us?
I haven't seen her. Maybe someone can help us?
No?
No?
If not, I think our next contribution is...
Edith est sur la liste des spectateurs.
Ah, here we are.
Je crois que ça y est, j'ai désactivé le son.
Okay.
Bonjour à tous. Je voudrais aborder une question qui ne... Vous m'entendez? Vous m'entendez?
Yes.
Oui. Alors, je voudrais aborder une question qui n'est que trop rarement prise en compte officiellement, celle de la pollution des armées en temps de guerre comme en temps de paix. Cette pollution concerne bien sûr les déplacements des véhicules terrestres, maritimes et aériens extrêmement coûteux en combustible carboné, comme le sont les échanges d'ailleurs de messages électroniques entre ces véhicules, entre leurs bases et à partir des satellites bien sûr. Les projets actuels du nouvel avion franco-germano-espagnol, le SCAF, ou du nouveau char blindé franco-allemand MGCS, sont conçus pour évoluer au milieu de nombreux aéronefs, drones, véhicules, avec qui les liaisons sont donc multiples et donc très énergivores. A-t-on pensé à prendre en compte la pollution émise dans le cadre des manœuvres en Europe en 2020 et 2021, puis celle de 2021-22 dans le secteur Indo-Pacifique, et en évaluer la propagation du Covid-19? Dénonce-t-on les dérèglements, les dégradations de notre environnement, le pillage des ressources, l'accaparement des terres pour les entraînements, les munitions laissées sur place sur les terrains de guerre, par exemple en Afghanistan, etc., par les armées des pays de l'OTAN? Dans le projet OTAN 2030, il est mentionné climat et défense verte. La lutte pour la diminution des gaz à effet de serre passe par la participation de chacun des États des pays membres. Et nous devons constater le retard actuel considérable par rapport aux accords de Paris, du traité de Paris. Ce qui est proposé dans le rapport, je cite, « Les alliés doivent investir dans les technologies vertes dans le but ultime d'améliorer leur efficacité militaire et de conserver leur avantage concurrentiel. La sécurité énergétique qui est abordée est vue sous l'aspect uniquement pas de rupture de ravitaillement pour l'OTAN. Tout est dit. Le but des études sur le climat à des fins militaires n'a jamais été de sauver la planète, comme le prouvent d'ailleurs les augmentations des budgets, notamment de l'arme atomique. Donc, je voulais juste proposer ça. Le Mouvement de la Paix a édité un livret sur ces questions de pollution militaire qui est téléchargeable gratuitement sur le site du Mouvement de la Paix. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Edith. Thank you also for mentioning the ecological disasters NATO is producing. So I have again to ask you for help. Is Özlem with us?
Did you say Azra? Dear friends, dear peace activists, I'm happy to send you today my greetings because you are working for a very important issue, keeping peace. Protesting for disarmament, this is so important. Today's NATO summit shows us again, the NATO is not interested in disarmament. The NATO will make military policy even on space. And this is not a good signal for the future of people. In the past, we have all seen what war means. We have all seen that NATO wars never bring peace to the world, never bring a good future for everybody. We see what happened in Mali. We see what happened in Afghanistan. We see what happened, for example, in Libya. And we see that armament never would mean peace and a good future for people all over the world. We are talking to each other today on an online version because we can't come together, because we're having a huge pandemic, because we see that real security means healthcare for everybody. And in these times, when we all need money for healthcare, in this time when we all need money for the social security systems in the member states of the European Union and all over the world, we see that member states of the NATO and even the European Union member states are spending more and more money for military mobility, for space militarization, for armament. And this is wrong. I think we need this money really for these needs of the people. And the needs of the people are not more money for militarization. Today, European Union, the first time in its history, has more budget lines for militarization. This is not right, and we are fighting against this at the left group in the European Parliament. We are fighting for social security, and we are fighting for peace, because peace is what we have to defend in these times.
Thank you very much indeed. That was a big thank you to Özlem Demirel from Germany. She is a member of the European Parliament. And now we turn to our next speaker. We're going back to Italy to hear from Marta Di Giacomo from the Anti-NATO Network. Marta, are you with us?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi everyone, I'm very happy to be a part of Voices for Peace. I bring greetings from Puterol Popolo from Italy. I think that today we need to talk about the dissolution of NATO after a pandemic in the middle of a climate crisis, when billions of pounds wasted in global military spending could have been used for welfare, for public health, for ecological transition, and not for war. And I'm sure that it is a shared opinion given recent protests against NATO. I think about the demonstration in solidarity with the people of Palestine, specifically about the mobilization organized by sectors of the working class. In Italy, the dock workers of Livorno decided to block a cargo ship loaded with weapons that was headed to the Israeli port, and the same was also done by Hamburg and Greece dock workers. So today, the Italian USB union has called for a national dock worker strike in favor of safe working conditions, which includes the ban of arms trafficking from all the ports. I think that these events showed a strong anti-militaristic feeling among people globally. But the most important thing is that the anti-militarist mobilization is transversal to all the others, because fighting against NATO is also fighting for a social and ecological justice. Thank you all.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you also for absolutely being in time, and thank you for the solidarity greetings from Italy. You know, we are coming now to a very small but very beautiful country, to Montenegro. And we have a video from a colleague from Montenegro, Pablo Dominguez, who is fighting against the destroying of the environment in Montenegro for NATO purposes, for NATO maneuver. Pablo Dominguez is coming from the movement Save Sinagovinana Montañas, and the floor is to him. Now we can see the video now.
Let's make the concrete example of Sinjavine, a cluster of pastoral commons in Montenegro that we have also started to study in depth. In fact, the biggest mountain pasture of the Balkans, one of the biggest in Europe, and a vital ecosystem that particularly favors biodiversity conservation. In 2019, the government of Montenegro, supported by NATO, decided to inaugurate a military training ground in Sinjavine, which is marked with that red rectangle on the map at the bottom right, which is next to two World Heritage Sites of UNESCO and within the Tara River Basin Biosphere Reserve, plus within a EU projected Natura 2000 site for the protection of particularly valuable species of birds that nest in these pastoral habitats and that are precisely favored by the local extensive livestock rearing, as well as a regional park for the protection of nature and culture that was supposed to be inaugurated by 2020, but that seemed to come to a standby due to the recent military plan that seemed to be just unconcerned about the damage this would represent to its people, their traditional uses, and to these socio-ecologically invaluable systems, co-built through a several times millenary symbiosis between humans and nature. This is especially astonishing when taking into account that the artillery testing ground had been inaugurated by dropping half a ton of explosives without any publicly available environmental impact assessment, health evaluation, economic impact study, or any substantial negotiation with the affected pastoral communities, while Montenegro is in accession talks with the EU, where things are usually done very differently.
Okay, that was very interesting. Shame we haven't got time to understand that issue more. Right, do we have the Philippines speaker? That's next on my list. No, that's a shame. We were hoping to hear from a left-wing youth platform from the Philippines. Okay, so it's now great pleasure for me to introduce my friend Ray Street from the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in the UK. Ray, lovely to see you. Over to you.
Thank you, Kate. And thank you, everybody. What a rich contributions we've had today. It's been fantastic. English speakers have for many years been making new names for the acronym NATO, the most popular being Nuclear Armed Terrorist Organization. Certainly, nuclear armed is more accurate than North Atlantic, as NATO, led by the United States, is pushed its global reach from countries around the Pacific to Africa, and we now know Latin America. The nuclear-armed NATO states, nuclear weapons belong to them, are integrated into NATO, and this includes the UK's, but really the United States, Trident nuclear-armed submarines, any warhead which could blow up the world. Provocatively, excuse me, they could at any moment be under the South China Sea. NATO still has a policy of first use of nuclear weapons and blocked member states from signing the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which the majority world supports. And as Kate said, in our own country, the majority support. NATO is a nuclear-armed, warmongering military alliance, dangerous and destabilizing force in the world, which swallows money which should be spent on health and social welfare. It should go. NATO should go. What we stand for is peace, social justice, not war. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray, for this mobilizing speech. And I think we are all with you in your fight, on our common fight against NATO. The next speaker is coming from Chile. And I'm very honored and happy that we have Pablo Ruiz with us today. Pablo, the floor is to you. And we are happy that we have also the support of the context to Latin America. Pablo, the floor is to you. Pablo.
Hola, ¿me escuchan? Sí. Bueno, le envío todo mi apoyo a la lucha contra la OTAN. Acá estamos apoyando al pueblo argentino que reclama la soberanía de Islas Malvinas, donde hay una base militar de la OTAN del Reino Unido, y también Colombia como bien dijo Laura, es socio de la OTAN. Estamos contra la guerra, contra el imperialismo. Creemos que la paz es algo que debemos defender. Hoy más que nunca el mundo está en peligro y debemos unir todas nuestras manos. La seguridad que necesitamos es la paz, no la guerra. Entonces, no a la OTAN, sí a la paz, y todo nuestro apoyo y abrazo desde América Latina de parte del observatorio para cerrar la Escuela de la América, una academia militar de los Estados Unidos que tanto daño ha causado a nuestros pueblos. Gracias.
Thanks very much, Pablo, and solidarity in your struggle. I'm now going to turn to the United States. We're looking forward now to hearing from David Swanson from World Beyond War. Welcome, David. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Great to be here. Let me know if you can't hear me okay. I want to offer my encouragement to everyone protesting NATO and striving to create a world that shuns entities such as NATO. I think a lot more people in the United States know that the G7 exists and that there's possibly something wrong with it this week, simply because some protesters walked around in giant papier-mâché heads. Unfortunately, they didn't wear prison uniforms the way the Bush-Cheney chain gang used to, but the actual G7 presidents did pose as self-removing racist monuments. We need a giant, comically evil NATO troop puppet licking US boots if people in the US are to pay any attention. 2 NATO members, the UK and France, recently sent warships to the island of Jersey to fight over the remaining fish. If they'd gone to war, every other NATO member would have been obliged by law, in violation of the UN Charter and the Kellogg-Briand Pact and other laws, to attack both of them and then to attack any others who had attacked either of them. But NATO saves its bombs for non-NATO members because Europe is such a peace-loving place. Biden wants NATO to impose rules on others. But when Congresswoman Ilhan Omar asked last week whether actual laws could be applied to those who wage wars, she was denounced by both big parties in US politics. US liberals are still suffering under the delusion that NATO is anti-Trump and anti-Putin, and that Trump serves Putin, and that Putin threatens the world. The New York Times today published a remarkably anti-NATO column that still claimed that Russia had seized Crimea after a coup mysteriously happened all by itself. Both parties in US politics want more hostility with Russia, and NBC News a few days ago tried to get World War III started in an interview with Putin. So count on the United States for nothing. Russia must stop taking the bait, and Europe must stop collaborating. Peace to all of you.
Thank you so much, David Swanson, for this voice from the United States of America. And I think we need much more common actions and activities in the future. And so this, I think, is a mission from this NATO summit and our protest actions. The next one is from a very nice organization, No to NATO Youth from Colombia. I think we should have more organizations, No to NATO Youth, in more countries in the world. I'm happy that I can give the floor now to Angelo Cardono. Angelo from Colombia. Angelo, the floor is to you.
Thank you, Raina. So NATO held the first NATO 2030 Youth Summit back on November 9, 2020, in cooperation with the Munich Security Conference. There, Jens Stoltenberg highlighted the important role of youth. He said in his opening remarks, "You, tomorrow leaders, both in North America and Europe, have the greatest stake in our security, so NATO 2030 is the chance for you to step up and safeguard your future, your freedom, your alliance." The alliance clearly understands that it is becoming obsolete and less relevant to next generations of political leaders. That's why it has started its indoctrination program for young people. NATO has prevailed using the excuse that it exists to fight international terrorism. Military interventions and nuclear arsenal do not help to keep the world safer. On the contrary, it increases the tension between countries and the possibility of new world-like confrontations. The false narrative of military security that NATO promotes through its consulting programs for politicians and the military is precisely what prevents us from living in a peaceful world. More weapons can only mean more tension, more war, and more death. The Atlantic Alliance has just selected 14 emerging leaders nominated as young leaders of NATO 2030, and their role will be to send recommendations to the Secretary General regarding the future of NATO. Young people are key to defining the future of the alliance. So new generations should advocate for the abolition of NATO, since it is our future that will be substantially affected by the permanence of this alliance. That is taking away vital resources with which we could build a more peaceful, just, and sustainable future. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Angelo. That's very interesting to hear from you, and very good luck with your work. Do we have Pat Elder with us in the room? No? Okay. Before I move on to the next speaker, I've had a message that we now have the video from Giulietta, so if that's the case, we will be able to come to that shortly. But in the meantime, our next speaker is from Cyprus. It's a pleasure to welcome Oz Karahan from the Union of Cypriots. Oz, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, dear friends, comrades, and people who are fighting for the peace all around the world. As we all know, North Atlantic terrorist organization is spreading imperialism, colonialism, and exploitation all over the world for 72 years. I'm talking to you right now from an island in Eastern Mediterranean where 5 NATO powers currently use its land for their imperialist aims in the region. Cyprus is a NATO-occupied country. The unitary structure of our country was ruined by NATO, and the occupation of Cyprus was planned in the NATO Foreign Ministers meeting in Lisbon in 1971. And the real occupation put on place in 1974. Since then, Cyprus is occupied by NATO, and NATO-backed federation plan is on the so-called peace table formed by NATO powers to protect the status quo. Because of this status quo, British, Turkish, Greek, American, and French military presence in our homeland continues today. We are witnessing an attempt of imperialists to give a life to their brain-dead organization, which only serves United States Kissingerist agenda. But they must know that we will not allow them to continue their crimes against humanity. And we, the people of the world, must not forget there is no salvation alone, either all of us or none. Therefore, we must learn from each other's struggles and unite against imperialism. We must say no to NATO, determined and firm. From NATO-occupied Cyprus, we, the Cypriots, salute all the peoples around the world who are giving national liberation struggles like us. We salute comrades who were representing the people's will in the protests in Brussels. We are right, and we will prevail. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. And now I would like to ask the regie, are we playing now the video from Giulietta, or are we continue with the next speaker from India, where this is also a video? So
yes, both videos are ready.
Okay, then we start with Giulietta, when you agree?
Yep.
Okay, Giulietta Dazer, living in Venezuela, coming from Colombia, is representing an organization of rebellions, and she was a speaker in our opening ceremony on Saturday. And yeah, Giulietta, the floor is to you, even when you are not in presence with us.
Un saludo desde Caracas a todas las personas y organizaciones que hoy se encuentran protestando en contra de la OTAN y sus políticas de militarización y guerra imperialista. Como colombiana, rechazo que mi país desde 2018 sea socio global de la OTAN y rechazo que los Estados Unidos tengan libre acceso a múltiples bases e instalaciones militares en Colombia. El Estado colombiano, bajo la tutela de los Estados Unidos, históricamente ha implementado una doctrina de seguridad que estigmatiza a su propio pueblo como enemigo interno, ha actuado con la más agresiva represión contra el pueblo y ha violado los derechos humanos, como se ha podido ver de una manera clara y dramática en el marco del actual paro nacional. Develando la verdadera naturaleza guerrerista de la OTAN, es precisamente este Estado terrorista de Colombia, este Estado represor, el que hasta ahora es el único socio global de la OTAN en la región de América Latina y el Caribe. Como latinoamericana y caribeña, protesto en contra de todas las bases e instalaciones militares estadounidenses y de la OTAN en nuestro territorio, de las que hay más de 70, incluyendo varias bases de la OTAN en el Caribe y los tristes ejemplos en nuestras Islas Malvinas en Argentina y la base de Guantánamo en Cuba. Como lo promulgó la CELAC en 2014 y como es el anhelo de nuestros pueblos en toda la región, esta región debe ser una zona de paz e integración. Pero esto se ve amenazado por las bases militares estadounidenses en la región y la alianza de Colombia con la OTAN como socio global. Entonces decimos no a la OTAN en el Atlántico Norte y no a sus pretensiones de expandirse y establecer alianzas alrededor de todo el mundo. No a la OTAN en América Latina y el Caribe. Y no al imperialismo y colonialismo estadounidense y europeo en nuestra región.
Great, that was so good that we were able to have that video from Giulietta. So now we turn to another video and from our next speaker from India, Vijay Prashad from the Tricontinental Institute.
I'm Vijay Prashad, Director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. What does North Atlantic refer to in the name North Atlantic Treaty Organization? Is NATO a defensive organization merely for the countries of the North Atlantic? Or in fact, is NATO a military alliance of North Atlantic states set up essentially to dominate the world? Is that what NATO is? Take a look at the recent 2020 report of NATO's Secretary General. It bristles with eagerness to talk about NATO's global footprint. 20 years ago, NATO participated with the United States government in the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. Then NATO participated in the destruction of Libya. Before that, NATO, betraying an agreement made with the USSR, advanced eastward towards the Russian border, destabilizing that region. It seems if you look at all this evidence that NATO's objective is not to protect Europe as it claims, but in fact its objective is to project the ambitions of the United States oligarchy and the oligarchies of Europe to prevent the growth of multipolarity. In the recent Secretary General's report, for instance, he writes the rise of China is a defining issue. He says that China's rise has potential consequences for our, meaning these oligarchies, security, prosperity, and way of life. To that end, NATO wants to expand to Australia, Japan, New Zealand, South Korea. NATO has already expanded across the Mediterranean into North Africa, into West Asia, and so on. NATO's ambition basically is global. Our ambition is to shut down NATO. We want the Brussels headquarters to become a museum of Belgium's crimes in the Congo. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for this presentation and the inspiring information what could be happened with this new headquarters of NATO. I think Ludo would be very happy to have for his peace organization a wonderful room in this headquarters. So the next speaker, I think John Lennon is not with us. Then the next speaker is Nilufer Kok from the Kurdish National Congress. Nilufer, the floor is to you, and I am very happy to welcome you at this meeting.
Thank you. Greetings from Brussels. Well, if we want to understand or see the truth face of the NATO, it's simple to look on the policy of NATO member state Turkey. Because when Turkey is using chemical weapons against the Kurdish freedom fighters of the PKK, and NATO is keeping silent, or when Turkish soldiers are raping Kurdish women in the Turkish occupied Kurdish city of Afrin in North Syria, and NATO is keeping silent, or when Turkey is burning the forests and killing civilians in Iraqi Kurdistan, NATO is keeping silent, that means NATO agreed on Turkey, because Turkey, as the only Muslim state, Muslim member state, and the state with the second biggest army in the NATO, is acting somehow for the benefits of expansion of NATO. So right now, two men are now talking, dealing about the destiny of the Kurdish people. Turkish dictator Recep Tayyip Erdogan and US President Biden are meeting right now. And the main issue they are going to talk about is whether they're going to give the Kurds the right to exist in the new strategy of Middle East or not. So before this meeting started, the Turkish dictatorship made clear to the US, I am ready to give up the S-400 missiles, which they bought from Russia against the NATO. So I will give up them if the US and other NATO member states will agree on Turkish policy of genocide against the Kurdish people. So these are my concrete and very actual reason why I say no to NATO and no to war.
Thanks very much indeed, Nilofer. We have immense solidarity with your struggle. And now we're going back to Belgium. We're going to hear from Mark Botenga, who is a member of European Parliament for the Left. Mark, over to you.
Thank you very much, and a very good evening to all. Very, very interesting. I think looking at it from the European Parliament and European institutions, the first thing that strikes, of course, is that just before the pandemic struck, European arms multinationals were already celebrating years of continuous increase in defense spending, and the European Commission actually noted that we do not spend too little on defense in Europe, but we spend way too much. The European Commission noted this as saying we have too many weapon systems. Now, if you say that you have too many weapon systems, then you could say, let's work together to spend less on defense. You know, that would be the kind of European cooperation one would actually appreciate. Looking at, you know, some European countries, I don't know, France and Germany together spend more than a country like Russia. And obviously that we know is not about defending ourselves, you know, it's about going to war abroad, and wars that we have seen from, let's say, just take Libya to Afghanistan, creating more chaos. Now, of course, the pressure of NATO and this desire to run the world, and not just Europe, some other people have said it today, has actually pushed and is pushing the European Union to increase its defense expenditure further. Because we have seen in the middle of a pandemic, of a health crisis, we have seen that basically not only has the European Union set up this new multi-billion fund for defense, the European Defense Fund, actually just a cash machine for weapons multinationals, for arms multinationals. No, it also has set up this so-called peace facility, which is really new speak for an arms facility, arms export facility. And now there's this new neighborhood development and international cooperation instrument, which is basically linking development cooperation a lot closer to security concerns, quote unquote. At the same time, it has been said, our healthcare systems are underfunded, hospitals are under pressure. You know, in a pandemic, you'd say, we're going to put the money there. You know, there's no better moment to actually make that shift. But this is political choices to run behind the United States, to actually lead sometimes in militarization rather than leading in, I don't know, public services, peace, and so on.
Mark?
Now, we need peace, put that money into public services, invest in health, not in war, no to NATO.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for the support from the left in the European Parliament. I think you were a great help for organizing all the events during the last days. Thank you so much for that. The next speaker, and I'm jumping quite around the world, is from Pakistan. Asra Sayed from the National Women Alliance of Pakistan. Azra, the floor is to you.
Thank you very much, Rainer. I am Azra Saeed, and the name of the alliance, it's a global alliance called the International Women's Alliance. Actually for many years, it had its headquarters in Europe, just moved to the US. I'm also the vice chair of the International League of People's Struggle and a member of the ILPS Peace Commission. Our work has been to protest against ongoing US imperialist militarism across the world and demand conditions that would allow for just and lasting peace. Today, I will speak as a Pakistani who has been fighting US militarism for many decades in my country. I have been a witness to the ongoing tragedy of the Afghan people due to the United States criminal warmongering in Afghanistan and Pakistan since the 80s. The US connived with the UN to send NATO troops in the region post 9/11. The NATO troops, along with US forces, have deliberately labeled Afghan and Pakistani citizens as terrorists. There has been open massacre of those innocent people, killing thousands in the Pakistani-Afghan war zones controlled by NATO forces. We know who are the real terrorists. In Asia, we have the slogan, the US is the world's #1 terrorist. Apart from those killed, thousands of Afghanis have been maimed and millions remain displaced across the world. Afghani children and women in various parts of the world, including Pakistan, suffer lives of extreme exclusion every day. On the documentaries, on the news, we see Afghani refugees taking humongous risks to come out of Afghanistan to have some semblance of a life in this world. The vicious unleashing of fundamentalists have been very much a diabolical strategy of the US backed by NATO. Even under such brutal atrocities, the rhetoric of NATO's partnership for peace with Afghanistan continues. And without shame, NATO's enduring partnership with Afghanistan is being used to throw an imperialist net, not only in Afghanistan, but adjoining countries in Central Asia. At the same time, the US is trying to barter a base in Pakistan and more emphasis on NATO's partnership with India. This is like a red flag to a bull in the region. This will initiate new rivers of blood and gore in the occupied regions of Kashmir, where Indian forces carry out violent war crimes equivalent to those in occupied Palestine.
Azra, could you begin to wind up, please?
Okay, the aim is the same, to occupy territories in Asia and to build a fortress against Asia. We believe that there cannot be a just and lasting peace without NATO being dismantled, without US imperialists being brought down. Let us forge ahead in our struggles for just and lasting peace. Long live international solidarity. I thank you all.
And thank you very much, Azra. Thank you for that message. And now we turn to the Netherlands again to hear from Vendela de Vries from Stop Arms Trade and the European Network Against the Arms Trade. Over to you.
Well, surprisingly, I want to speak about climate change, because climate change is supposed to be an issue at the NATO summit today, or more specific, climate security, which means how the deployability of NATO forces and the interest of NATO countries are threatened by climate change. Because when NATO speaks about climate security, it means the security of NATO members and forces. NATO is not an organization for global security. It is protecting the interest of its members. So while climate disaster is unfolding, NATO will be protecting the over-consuming rich countries against the victims from climate change from the global south. Well, NATO forces are huge climate polluters themselves. Somebody else mentioned it already before. We do not know exactly the figures of NATO emissions because they do not publish it, and armed forces have no obligation under the Paris Climate Treaty. But there will certainly be more emissions when NATO countries are raising their defense budgets. More weapons means more emissions. NATO is promising to reduce its emissions, and that is possible for greenhouse gas emissions in infrastructure. It is relatively easy to add solar panels on a military basis or to build a windmill on a compound, but it is not possible to reduce NATO greenhouse gas emissions of weapon systems and military transport without a reduction of weapons, exercises and deployments. It is just not possible to produce an eco tank or an electric F-35 fighter jet. Suggestions about net zero emissions in 2050, which are done before this summit by NATO officials, they are bullshit. This technology does not exist. Still, the arms industry sees a possibility for profit here. Already they are including sustainability paragraphs in their annual reports, and they are bluffing about low carbon planes and warships. And they will certainly start promoting simulation equipment and drones and cyber warfare as low carbon extras that countries should buy on top of their high carbon heavy raw material. For the arms industry, climate change is just creating an extra market. And that is why organizations working against arms trade are looking at this climate emission issue from an arms perspective. Low carbon warfare is a perverse concept, and it is also impossible. The only way to reduce military carbon emission is by disarmament, and which is contrary to what NATO is doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendela. And maybe the final speaker, and I have to look if I can see him, is Grigori Piccin from Italy. Grigori, are you with us? I cannot see him. Can someone see him? No. So, you know, then it's for me to say 3 words at the end. You know, I'm really astonished about this picture by the different speeches. They gave us so an impression of the worldwide protest against NATO militarism. They show that everywhere in the world are actions, people active against militarization and against NATO. This movement is alive, this movement is present, this movement has hundreds of very convincing arguments. This movement is in NATO countries, but also in out NATO countries. It understands that NATO is the military alliance in the world, and I'm really impressed of the variety, of the diversity of the arguments against NATO and arms race. So thank you, all of you, and I will give the floor to Kate for the final words for this event. Kate, the floor is to you. And thank you for your nice moderation.
And same to you, Rainer. And thanks everybody for coming and joining us this evening, to the speakers for those incredible reports and greetings from around the world. And thank you to our audience. I know that you're all very active, working for peace, working against NATO and in so many diverse ways. People have talked about the climate and the climate catastrophe and the relationship to militarism, to arms trade. We've heard about the situation for Palestine, the need for global justice. All these issues are interlinked, and they are issues that we all address in one way or another. And I think for me, the 2 very powerful words that spring to mind as a result of this discussion is solidarity and unity. You know, it's common in our movement to say those things, but they really are the fundamental principles. So let's work together in unity and solidarity to abolish NATO and inaugurate a world of peace, justice and equality. Thank you very much.
And in the name of No to War, No to NATO, I would like to thank the translators for their great work. Thank you so much for their big help that everyone could understand the nice and impressive words which were done by all of you, speakers and participants at that meeting. And thank you to the European left in the Parliament and the European left as party for the big support making these events possible. And I'm sure that we will see each other again on the street by the next actions for peace against militarism and NATO. I wish all of you a nice day, or we wish all of you a nice day, a nice afternoon, or a nice evening. Thank you for joining this event.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye, peace to you.
Bye-bye.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Do widzenia,
Ciao, ciao.
Paula. Do widzenia,
Ciao.
Paula. Ciao.
Nos veremos.
See you again.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Good evening.
Okay, and share the video. It's recorded. You can find it on the page.
Большое
Facebook page.
спасибо, Юрий.
Пожалуйста, будь ласка, українською.